Hello and welcome to Political Thinking. It's not every week that a political party declares that the man who led it at the last election, the man the party proposed to be our next Prime Minister, is now considered unfit to be a Member of Parliament. That, though, is what happened this week when Keir Starmer declared that his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, would not be representing the Labour Party at the next election. My guest on Political Thinking this week is one of those who's urging Starmer on. Steve Reed, Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, was a founder member of the Labour Together group, a group that tried to keep people in the Labour Party when many were thinking of leaving it during the Corbyn years. And this week, he's announcing a new approach to crime, an approach that promises to prevent crime, punish criminals and protect communities. And he says that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, Labour gave the impression they were more concerned about the criminals than they were about the victims. Steve Reed, welcome to Political Thinking.
Thank you, Nick. Good to be here.
When Keir Starmer finally announced what, let's be honest, we all knew he was going to announce, that there was no way back for Jeremy Corbyn, as someone who's a veteran of the struggle inside the party, how did it make you feel?
I felt relieved, is the truth of it. And there are two reasons for this. One is the necessity for Keir, as the leader of the Labour Party, to show that he has changed the party if he's going to change the country. And that has been done. But for me too, my history in politics goes back to Lambeth, where I was first elected as a councillor and later became the council leader. And Lambeth had previously been run by the hard left under Ted Knight. So I had seen the damage that they can do and how they can alienate the Labour Party from the public. And
Red Ted, as he was known in the 80s, wasn't he? In the tabloids,
he was known as Red Ted.
Call him part of the loony left.
And was close to Corbyn. And, I'd seen it before. We'd fought it off in Lambeth. We'd won the party back in Lambeth. And we'd actually run a pretty decent council after that by connecting back with communities. So when I saw Corbyn come in as Labour leader, my fear was that we would see a repeat of that, and we did see a repeat of that with the anti-Semitism, with the moving away from where our voters were, and it culminated in our worst electoral defeat in December 2019 for 85 years, and that is what we've had to rebuild from. So I was heartbroken when Corbyn was elected leader because I'd seen what the hard left had done in Lambeth, and I'm relieved that we are now at the end of that process and that Keir has genuinely taken this party back and, in his words, made it the political wing of the British people again, which is what it needs to be.
And we're going to talk about what that means for crime and for punishment. But before we do, I can't help but point out, given how dreadful it is, how did you and Keir Starmer go to the electorate and say, make him our next Prime Minister? Because you did.
We were faced with a choice at that point, and it happens to different parties at different times. If you don't like the direction it's going in, do you walk off the pitch and leave it to those who you don't agree with, or do you stay on the pitch and try to win it back?
Well, let's talk about what you are saying about crime then when it comes to what working people care about. It's quite a quote, isn't it, that I read out in the introduction. Labour gave the impression they were more concerned about the criminals than their victims. Really? In what way?
I think we did give that impression. And some of it was about how the party at that point was talking about. There was too much trying to understand what had led an offender into offending, which sounded like excusing their behaviour, and not enough talking about how we supported victims, understood the need, the human need for retribution.
It's quite a phrase, need for retribution.
Yes.
You've been a victim of crime. You were involved in a mugging case.
I was.
Quite a few years back.
Yep. What happened? I was walking back from a barbecue. It was probably late in the evening I think it was probably a Sunday evening. I walked round the corner in Clapham in South London, where I was living in a shared house at the time. And two guys jumped out on me from behind a wall, put a knife at my throat, took my bag, rifled my pockets, took my wallet, let go, punched me in the stomach and ran off. And, I called the police. We had a police station nearby. Because we had bobbies on the beat back then, I knew the name of our local police officer. They came in a squad car. We looked around there. We couldn't find anything. Later on that evening, I got home afterwards and I was looking in doing my teeth in the mirror, there was a nick on my neck where the knife had been, and that is when your mind turns. You think how much worse that could have been, and you've been assaulted. They've taken things from me. They could have caused serious physical harm. Yes, I did feel the need for retribution. I wasn't thinking, I wonder what went wrong in their lives that led them into doing this thing. I went, these people have just done this to me. They probably are doing it to other people as well. They need to be got hold of and they need to be stopped.
Now, one way of trying to stop people becoming victims of crime is to catch criminals when they're young. Try to stop them becoming, in the jargon, a career criminal. All this week, Labour have been announcing a new approach to crime, and you're proposing, specifically on the issue of parenting, that in the case of someone who commits a crime, their parents could become the subject of a parenting order. What have you got in mind?
Well, I mean, the first point you say is really important. You know, we talk about the crime escalator. Serious criminals start out doing lower level crimes. So if you can catch them and divert them away through appropriate sanction and support, you can stop them committing those crimes in the first place. You can stop the crime in a young life becoming a life of crime. That's to everybody's benefit, the individual offender, but more importantly, people who will never become their victims because they've been stopped. So if you look at antisocial behaviour, low-level offending, it absolutely scars and debilitates many communities up and down this country where people feel the wrong people are in control of the streets. So we need a range of measures to start to tackle that, to give people back control of their own communities. One of those is parenting orders. One of the proposals we've come up with is parenting orders. And what this is you've very often got parents whose kids are committing multiple offences, but the parents are not taking their parental responsibility seriously. So we will allow the police to issue parental orders that will require a parent to go on a training course to learn how to better manage their kids. Now, I've spoken to many parents in these circumstances. It's not simply punitive, because many parents in this situation are at their absolute wits' end. They do not want their kids committing crime, ending up in a youth offending institute, ending up in prison. They want their kids to have a decent life.
It's one
Every
thing
parent
if that
wants
child
that.
is 10, 11, 12. But if these are big, strapping teenage, usually lads,
Yeah.
is a parenting order really going to allow a parent to get control
You do
of
it
a
when
teenager?
the kid is at the first. The ages that kids start offending can be surprisingly young. 10 and 11-year-olds can be offending, vanishing from home. And it's at that point you need to support the parents to get control of them. And
if
many
they
parents
don't
will
want-
welcome that.
Yeah, many do, and indeed there are parenting classes offered by councils up and down the country.
Yeah.
You can find them now. But you're talking about something different, which is compulsory
Mandating them in
parenting
those
classes.
circumstances.
So what?
That's right.
You go along to mum and dad, or it may be mum or just dad, and say, right, little Johnny's nut is now out of control, and they might say something with the word "offin." You know, you try and sort them out. I can't control them. What do you then do? Slap the mum or the dad into prison?
I've spoken to people in this situation, though, Nick, and that isn't generally what they say. You know, parents love their kids. You know, if their kids are tearaways, if their kids are committing these kind of offences, the parents don't want their kids doing that. They want to know how they can better turn their lives around. And if we can offer more support, and yes, it's going to be mandatory, but many parents will welcome that, is my experience. They want their kids to do well in life. They do not want their kids criminalised and ending up in prison, but they need a bit more help. And sometimes with that help, there needs to become a shove.
Refuse, wouldn't you?
Well, there are sanctions for breaking all sorts of orders, but the key point here is to help the parent by carrot and stick to accept support that will turn their kids' lives around. And from speaking to parents in that circumstance myself, they will welcome it.
Would you philosophically be interested in going even further? Because you will know, if you talk to the criminologists, you talk to people like you who used to run a council where there's high crime levels, they will be able to say, that house, that family, that flat, we know where the crime's coming from. Even for kids as young as 2, 3 and 4. Not that they commit crimes, but they will go on, it is feared, and commit crimes. You could say, let's intervene much earlier with those families. But of course, there'll be some who say you're stigmatising them, you're labelling them.
Well, interesting, because that's exactly what we did when I was leader at Lambeth Council. It's not just about criminal justice; it's also about family support and youth services, the provision of positive activities for young people to do. And back in, it was a long time ago, Nick. It was in 2006. I was elected leader of the council in Lambeth. But over that year, 06-07, 3 teen homicides, any number of other kids getting involved in gangs, open drug dealing on the streets outside the train stations, businesses closing down, people frightened to go into those areas. We had to do something about it. And we commissioned the biggest piece of research that had ever been done into the causes of violent youth crime, and then structured a series of interventions around that. There were many of them, and I'm sure we won't have time to go into all of them, but one of them was earlier intervention with families and supporting families. But quite often that support came better for those families if it was linked to somebody who was living the same life in the same community as them. So we had a programme called Home Start, which got parents living in a similar community from a similar background who had successfully parented their kids and linked them with the families that were struggling and gave them advice. And the helping family was supported to support that family, and it really made a difference.
We talked a bit about Lambeth, where you grew up politically, but it's not where you actually grew up. You grew up in Watford. Let's talk about
St
your...
Albans, actually. Just down the road from Watford. Yeah,
Let's talk about your family. Now, a lot of people think St Albans, it's the south. St Albans, quite posh actually, it's a commuter place for people travelling into London for often well-paid jobs in the City of London, actually. So yours was not a tough, rough, red wall-y sort of upbringing.
Well, it certainly wasn't. It wasn't tough and rough. I wouldn't say that. My parents are listening. We lost my dad last year, but my mum, that wouldn't be fair to characterise it that way. But what happened? There is a sort of an analogy with what happened in those communities in the north, where industry was taken away and nothing was put back in their place. That's the red wall. We were more of a red brick, because we were living in the south, and obviously the same circumstances didn't apply as in the former industrialised areas. But my family all worked in a print factory in Watford called Oddham's. My dad worked there, all of my uncles worked there, all of my aunties worked there, my grandparents worked there. The intention was, as I was growing up, I was going to work there as well. My grandparents had worked there as well. It was this epicentre of our community.
But you thought that would be your life?
I was told this was going to be my life because it was a decent job, a decent wage, a secure sense of who you were, what job you were going to do. So I was brought up speaking the language of print works. We did our summer holidays with people from the factory. We had Christmas parties for the kids in the factory. My godparents worked at the factory as well. It was our life. But it
and the
closed
but in
down.
this case is not that you changed your mind, but it
closed down. So during the Thatcher recession, just as happened in many parts of the north, it closed down, and all of those people in my family that worked there lost their jobs, and they'd been working there for several generations. I would have been the third generation going there if that had happened, and for those people, nothing was put in its place. It was a microcosm of of having your steelworks closed down or having a pit closed down, because our whole community, our whole life was centred around this one place, and people's lives fell apart, if I'm really honest.
Is that the first time you felt political, when you thought, in your opposition to what you blame Margaret Thatcher for, back in 1982? We ought to say as a note, by the way, it was owned by Robert Maxwell, who was a prominent Labour supporter all his life.
Yes.
Former boss of the Mirror, of course.
It was. It made me angry. Because I could, by this point, I was a teenager. I was seeing what was going on up and down the country. I was seeing people's lives and livelihoods being taken away. But the key was not that you should be anti-change, but there was nothing put in its place. There was no industrial strategy. There was no training for the new jobs that have come and replaced it. People were thrown on the scrap heap. So I saw talented, compassionate, caring people that I loved enormously have their lives thrown away. And I felt that profoundly. And I felt a government that allows this to happen is not a government I can support. So it was about that time I joined the Labour Party, age 16. Our family had always been Labour, but no one was a member of it. I joined the Labour Party.
And there was another reason, wasn't there, that you became more and more political. And you were open about your politics, but you weren't open for many years about the reason... The deep personal reason.
That's right.
That you felt angry with the Conservative Party.
Well, my sexuality, because I was growing up gay and I was still coming to terms with it in my teenage years. Back then it was the era of AIDS. You saw TV adverts on the television with headstones collapsing, telling you not to die of ignorance. And of course I was terrified by all of that. So leave aside the other social pressures on you not to be gay at that point. I didn't really come out until my 20s. But by the time I was coming to terms with that and coming to terms with who I was, there was the Thatcher government enacting legislation, Section 28 was part of it, that was gratuitously describing gay relationships as pretend family relationships, banning children being taught about sexuality in school. So kids like me growing up gay, no one would speak to you about it. So where'd you get your information from? You just heard negative things. You saw negative stereotypes.
Last year, you talked about growing up gay during a time of Tory-fuelled hate, and you showed off your wedding ring.
That's right.
Because you got married.
Well,
it would be fair to point out that it's only thanks to a Conservative-led government that you were able to get married. It was David Cameron's government that legislated gay marriage.
Yes, but most Tory MPs voted against it, and it was Labour MPs that got that through. But for me, the story here is it's actually a story of why politics matters. You know, people quite often say to me, if you're knocking on the doors, you still get some people say, I'm not going to vote, it doesn't make any difference. And it couldn't be more profound for me. There I was, on marches outside Parliament against Section 28, and then, some years later, there I was in Parliament. Almost the very first debate I spoke in and voted on was for equal marriage, and now I have a wedding ring on my finger because I finally last year got married to my long-term partner, now husband. Now, what a story of change and transformation of our country, but also personally for me, it couldn't be more profound than I am now allowed to openly love the person I love. It couldn't be more profound, and yet we had a government telling me that I wasn't allowed to be who I was second class, my relationship didn't count. I couldn't tolerate that. So my experience was the Conservatives in their recession allowed my family and my community to sink with no support for them to pick up the pieces or contribute in the way that they wanted to, but also they were trying to stop me loving the person I loved gratuitously. So I'm no Conservative.
That much is clear, and people often remark that in Parliament you sound more angry with the Tories than many other people who speak from the Labour front bench. Just briefly, before we return to your responsibilities, there is, of course, another cause at the moment, which for some people is an exact parallel with gay rights. It's the issue of trans rights. And for some, it is exactly that sort of issue, standing, empathising with, fighting for people who feel victims. There are others, and I discussed it at length last week with the new chair of Stonewall, who say, actually, it's a bit different because trans rights can intrude in certain circumstances on women's rights. Do you think the Labour Party on this issue has to move a bit? Because the Labour Party has not been very clear on the broader issue that women's rights in other safe spaces could be at risk.
Yeah, well, as the Shadow Justice Secretary, I've been pretty crystal clear on that one. You know, I've said you're not going to put somebody who rapes women in a women's prison. I think what's happened in the Labour Party is that people were trying hard not to cause offence to the trans community and then inadvertently cause concern among some women that we weren't properly respectful of their interests too, but we absolutely are. And it's always going to be about balancing rights and responsibilities, but protecting the rights and interests and safety of women needs to be paramount for all of us.
Perhaps it's also something to do with the phrase you used at the beginning of this interview when you said that Keir Starmer wanted to be the arm of the British people, a phrase I think first used by Tony Blair, incidentally, all those years ago.
Yes.
Do you see the position you've just outlined, the position you've talked about on crime and punishment and so on, as reconnecting the Labour Party with the sorts of voters who had concluded that you were really about sort of avocado eating, Guardian reading, or, you know all the insults that are sometimes used, wokerati, not my language, let me stress, but the language I suspect is and will be used by the Tories' new Vice Chairman Lee Anderson?
Well, any political party that can't win the support of enough British voters to get into government is never going into government. You're not a party of government, then you're a party of protest. We need to become a vehicle for the British people to make the change it wants to see. That's what is meant by the political wing of the British people.
The fear, though, of some of your supporters is that what you do is actually abandon all your values and beliefs in order to get elected. Let's just take another example in your remit. When Keir Starmer ran for leader, he was asked if he'd decriminalise cannabis, and he replied, I wouldn't immediately. make it pretty clear that he was in favour of a much more relaxed
Well,
attitude.
I don't know. I don't remember that.
To
I didn't,
cannabis.
I
Well,
didn't hear that. And
that- I've supported schemes, he went on, where cannabis possession, you're not arrested for it, you're not prosecuted for it. I believe in that.
Well, a lot of police forces don't immediately arrest you for small-scale possession, to be honest, because they're taking decisions about the best use of their time. But Kira's appointed me Shadow Secretary of State for Justice. I'm responsible for that policy area. My experience of seeing kids die on the streets of South London because of their involvement with drug dealers and drug gangs, and the fear, the horror that I saw in the parents' eyes when I met them afterwards, tells me we're not going to be legalising drugs. What we need to do is give those kids better alternatives to getting involved in the kind of gangs that will destroy their lives while they destroy their community around them.
Shadow Justice Secretary worked with Yvette Cooper, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, on drug policy and lots besides. She decided she wanted to say what she'd done when she was younger, that she'd smoked cannabis. Do you think we have a right to know the answer to that question?
Oh, you certainly have a right to ask it. Yeah. And I did once at university, but I didn't like it, and I didn't do it again. I've never smoked cigarettes. It's a thing I regret.
So on drug policy, you're clear. I couldn't help noticing, though, that you also talk in your policy of something rather interesting: a trauma-informed criminal justice system. Just start, if you would, by telling us what that means.
Yes, so it sounds quite jargonistic. What we're trying to tackle here is, how do you prevent crime at source? How do you stop it happening so that people don't become criminals all the way through their lives? And if you look at a lot of criminals, hardened criminals, or even lower level offenders, it often stems from the experience very early on in their life. So the language used for this is childhood trauma. Adverse childhood experiences is some of it as well. And what that means is, if a baby is born into a family where there's domestic violence happening, and as they start to develop consciousness, they see violence in the home, or there's a parent addicted to drugs who cannot give them the love and the attention that they need when they need it, that affects that child's cognitive and emotional development, and it can also affect their sense of right and wrong. So they don't have the same sense of right and wrong as most other people would have, and that makes them more likely to go into crime. So by tackling that trauma, early intervention, as we were talking about before, family support, helping to stop those traumatic experiences becoming hardwired into a brain as that child develops, you can make it less likely that they offend.
Isn't there a tension, almost a contradiction, if you like, between talking about the trauma of someone who carries out a crime and, on the other hand, saying, look, we mustn't pay too much attention to what causes crime, we've got to worry about the victims?
No contradiction at all. None whatsoever. Because what we're saying here, that is, in some circumstances, an individual that has had these traumatic experiences early on in their life goes on to offend. But most do not. So there is an element of choice here, and people making bad choices who then go on to cause harm to society. Then we do need to deal with that choice that they've made. But as I was saying about my own experience, for all that I wanted punishment for the people that held me up with a knife, I'd much rather never have been held up with a knife. So if, and I don't know their backgrounds obviously, if there's an opportunity to intervene earlier on in a child's development to stop them becoming criminalised, why would you not do that? Because you're stopping people becoming victims of crime. Why would you not do that? It keeps people safer.
Think of a phrase, a slogan that could sum this up. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime.
Well, it is. You're right, and that was Tony Blair's phrase 30 years ago this year. Actually, he first came up with that. But we need to take that slogan and make it meet the future, the challenges of today, and the years to come.
But you're unapologetic about it being
of course
a reworking of.
It. Yeah.
Do you call yourself a Blairite?
I was in the Labour. I've joined the Labour Party at age 16 before anyone had ever heard of Tony Blair. So I've always considered myself just Labour. We've had various leaders. I hugely respect Tony Blair and the changes that he made.
From him, yeah.
I learned from many other things.
Do you understand, though,
from the streets of South
bringing us full
London.
circle, why some people this week who supported Jeremy Corbyn find that very hard to take? 20 years ago this week, he was out on the streets campaigning against the Iraq war, a war pursued by Tony Blair. broad point would be Corbyn's analysis proved to be right on a whole host of issues, and Tony Blair's proved to be wrong.
No, I don't agree with that for a second. Tony Blair was elected Prime Minister in 1997, won 3 elections in a row and transformed this country. He made it stronger, he made it wealthier, he reduced crime, he improved schools. Jeremy Corbyn lost 2 elections catastrophically and left Labour unelectable. No comparison.
Steve Reed, thanks very much indeed for joining me on Political Thinking.
Thank you, Nick.
It's not a phrase that Steve Reed would use, not a phrase that Keir Starmer would use, but there's a growing sense that Labour is going back to the future. Back, they say, to a connection with working class voters who the party was founded by and to represent. There is, of course, a danger, though, that those very voters may say, that isn't what you were saying to us 4 years ago, when you were arguing for Jeremy Corbyn to be our next Prime Minister. How that plays out could shape much of the next year in British politics. Thanks for watching.